People always ask me, they say, Michael, I'm getting too strong. The main movements aren't working. I need supplemental movements. And I always tell them the same thing. I say, you can't spell supplemental without mental. So let's get right into it. Hey guys, Coach Michael here at Starting Strength Boston today. And I'm going to be talking about supplemental / assistance movements. I've also heard them referred to as accessories on the internet. But basically, the way I'm going to define one of these bad boys is a movement that closely mimics the parent movement. Parent movements being the squat, the bench press, the press, and the deadlift. And so it's going to be a close variation of that, right? So there's a few things I'm going to talk about within that, why this is helpful, why we need to use it, all that stuff. So the main reason that you would need to use one of these bad boys is because your main movement is not sufficient to drive progress. So let's say you've been, running up your deadlift, you were doing it 3 times a week, then you started doing it twice a week, then you started doing it once a week, and then you even started just adding weight once every 3rd week, varying rep ranges and stuff like that. And eventually that just isn't enough to drive progress. So now at this point, you're gonna have to implement some exercise variation. And this is a good way to do it, right? So the way a supplemental / assistance movement works, at least this is my theory, is that the main movement over time, you just become very adapted to it, right? So by the time you're implementing one of these on your deadlift, for example, you may have been deadlifting for like a year at this point, doing the same thing over and over again because that's been working, so there's no need to vary it. But by this point, you're very adapted to the deadlift. And if we could touch on the exercise criteria, we're using the most amount of muscle mass over the longest effective range of motion to lift the most amount of weight. So within those criteria, we're using the same muscle mass in the same way each time, over the same range of motion each time, and we're able to add weight to the bar. So the only real variable that's changing there is the weight on the bar, right? And so by the time you're very adapted to that movement and you're not adding weight to the bar very often, then you're not really disrupting homeostasis very much. You're not giving your body a reason to adapt. So we can sort of repeat the novice effect by varying different aspects of the exercise selection criteria. So for example, if you're deadlifting, and you're adding in a rack pull, then you're shortening the range of motion, you are changing the type of muscle mass that you're using, which I'll touch on in a second, and then you are greatly increasing the amount of weight that you can use in the movement. So you're disrupting homeostasis by introducing a new effect, and sort of reproducing a novice effect in that sense. And in the second half of this video, I'm going to get into different sort of examples and kind of give like templates based off the different lifts and how you can program around them with different assistance movements. And then I'm going to touch on these core principles of programming again, SRA and the SAID principle. So stress recovery adaptation, like I just touched on a whole bunch. By this point in your training career, the stress of the parent movement is not sufficient to drive adaptation, so you got to employ these exercise variations to do that. And the SAID principle is very important in this case because by this point in your training, you may have, or different lifters may have very different goals, right? Like one person might be trying to just get their deadlift as strong as possible. One person might be training for physique, so they're trying to emphasize like a certain body part or something. So they're gonna do like a specific exercise variation that emphasizes that body part, right? And so at this point, everything's very individual, very specific. So we have to consider each trainee's individual goals. And that's why I'm going to go through specific examples, because there are a lot of different movements you could use and different ways that you could use the movements. All right, so here's our first example. As I alluded to before, actually, this is the deadlift. So we have a 30-year-old guy. That doesn't matter so much, but his deadlift is stuck at 445. So he's done his NLP. He's done his early intermediate phase. Maybe he's done some early advanced programming as well, but he's only ever deadlifted. So now at this point, a good way to get the deadlift unstuck, and this works like pretty universally for most people, is to utilize the rack pull and the halting deadlift. So I'll kind of go through these like one at a time, even though they complement each other, and how they work. So as I talked about before, we're kind of modifying the exercise selection criteria a little bit with these movements. And it's not like an all or nothing change, so it's not like you go from a long range of motion to no range of motion. It's not like you go from a lot of muscle mass to no muscle mass. Everything is kind of on a slider here, right? I think of it like a spectrum. So for the halting deadlift, right, we had a long range of motion from the floor all the way to lockout. Now the range of motion is from the floor to just above the knee, right? So the range of motion is shorter. And we're trading that for an emphasis on different muscle groups. So with the halting deadlift, you're really going to emphasize the lower back because you're trying to stay leaned over and preserve the moment arm on the back. So you're really training the lower back to a larger degree than even the deadlift. And then you're also emphasizing the push off the floor, so a lot of knee extension, which is going to overload the quads as well. And then the last part of this is like the biggest benefit of the halting deadlift, and an even bigger benefit in the rack pull, is you can use more weight by trading these different things here. So by using the short range of motion, you can add a whole bunch of weight, right? So the reason the deadlift got stuck, as I said before, is because you're just doing the same thing over and over again. So you're adapted to that range of motion. You're adapted to that muscle mass being trained in that same way. And then if you're advanced enough, you're not really adding a load very frequently. So you're adapted to that more or less. So by adding a whole bunch of weight all of a sudden, you're able to disrupt homeostasis and apply a new stress. And then you can unstick your deadlift, right? And the rack pull on the other side of that, very, very similar. It's a shorter range of motion, starting just below the knee, moving to the lockout. You're emphasizing different muscles. You're emphasizing very heavily the entire back, the lower back and the upper back, and then also the prime movers of the posterior, like the glutes and the hamstrings. And then you can add a lot more weight in the rack pull, depending on where you do it from as well. If your goal is just to like load it super heavy and get a whole bunch of weight on your back, then you can totally just do it from like right around the knee. And then if you want more carryover to your deadlift, if you're trying to like really blast a sticking point, for example, you can do it a little bit lower, like just below the sticking point, so like mid-shin-ish, something like that. But yeah, that's a pretty universal way to unstick the deadlift, very tried and true. Let's look at a more specific example for the next one. Okay, so in this example, we have a short-armed individual that their bench press has gotten stuck, right? So in this example, because they have really short arms, which is advantageous for the bench press, their bench press has gotten stuck due to a lack of stress. So if you don't know this already, your leverages are going to affect the total range of motion. So like if you're hypothetically somehow able to be like 3 feet tall, you don't have to move the bar very far, right? So you're not stressing yourself all that much. And so it's a lot easier to move the bar, right? So like someone that has short arms in the bench and can arch their chest up is only going to have to move the bar maybe like 4 inches versus someone with like really long arms is going to have to move it 12 inches or something like that. So in this case, the person has a short range of motion, and so they're able to load their bench up pretty heavy through the NLP, through the intermediate phase, right, just with benching. But then at this point, their bench gets stuck, and so the solution I have for that is the close grip bench. And so this is going to manipulate the exercise selection criteria differently than our deadlift example. In that example, we wanted more weight to make it heavier, right? In this case, the person, because they have advantageous leverages, their bench is already like kind of heavy. So we're going to do the opposite. We're going to implement the close grip bench, which gives us a longer range of motion and allows us to lift less weight, but it's going to hit the different muscle groups in a different way because of the longer range of motion. So in this scenario here, rather than adding a whole bunch of volume and a whole bunch of sets on just the bench, which you could totally do, right? You could totally just like bench 3 times a week and do like a bunch of 5x5s, or bench even more than 3 times a week sometimes. But I think a more efficient way to do that, and a lot more fun for a lot of people, is to just implement a longer range of motion movement like the close grip bench. So then you can still get more bang for your buck out of a single training session. And that way you're not having to come into the gym, 4 or 5 times a week and like bench nonstop all the time. So basically the way it works is you are working the longer ROM. You got different muscle groups. With the close grip bench, it's kind of a little bit more tricep heavy, but you're also working the pecs and the shoulders through a longer range of motion just because of the nature of the close grip. You're having to bring the bar down a lot further by doing that, so it's working everything through a longer range of motion. And then the trade-off is that you can't load as much weight. But because your main bench press, like I said, you have the short arms, you're already loading a bunch of weight on that one. So you're treating this more like, almost like a hypertrophy movement. But yeah, that's one example there. Let's check out a different one. And for this next one, the person's gonna have a different goal than just getting their lift super strong. All right, this example relates to the squat. We've got a long femored individual, and they want big quads, big meaty quads.
Big meaty claws!
So they've been doing a lot of low bar squatting, as you should be. And because they have the long femurs, they're really emphasizing the posterior chain. And so they have like a giant booty, big old dump truck ass, and they want to grow the quads, right? So here's the way that they're going to do that. They're going to implement either a high bar, a front squat, or a safety squat bar squat, right? And so each of those are going to kind of like vary this to different degrees with slightly different trade-offs. But the general idea is that we're getting more range of motion on the target joint to grow the quads, right? So the quads primarily cross the knee joint, so we need a longer range of motion on the knee joint. Because this changes your center of mass, combined center of mass, each of these lifts, you're putting more emphasis on the knee joint by being more upright during the lift. And so you're emphasizing the muscles that cross the knee joint, primarily the quads, extending the knee. And the trade-off is that you're using less weight in each of these variations, right? So you're not going to be able to squat as much as your low bar squat. You're using less weight, and you're putting more range of motion on specifically the knee when you're doing these movements, right? And so what that's going to do is grow your quads, blow them up. So if your goal is pure vanity, like we got here, that's one way to implement these movements. And the way they vary, the high bar and the safety bar squat are pretty similar. And then the front squat, you're going to get even more range of motion on the knee and even less weight. So I recommend like high bar or safety bar as a starting point, just to kind of, start more gradually. And then if you really are feeling frisky, you can go all the way into the front squat. All right, now the final example. This one's with the press. So this person has the specific goal of getting their press as strong as possible, but they also have a specific problem with their press. They always fail right around the forehead in the lift, right? And so this person, I'm going to program them a pin press. And the reason I'm going to do that is because we can train not just a shorter, but a more specific range of motion, right? So the trade-offs in this one are, like I said, you have that shorter and very specific range of motion. So if you're failing at the forehead, maybe start it from like the nose, like a little bit below, just to make sure that you're getting all that, problem area. You're going to use more or less the same muscles. The only difference in the pin press from the regular press in terms of the actual movement is that you're not using the hips. So you're starting it off the pins using pretty much the same muscles and everything, and you're able to load a lot more weight because the range of motion is a lot shorter, and you're able to overload and get stronger through the weak range of motion, which is then going to carry over to the actual press, make it stronger, and allow you to bust through that plateau. All right, so in conclusion here, whenever you're programming these assistance or supplemental movements, you want to consider the SAID principle, right? Specific adaptation to impose demand. So whatever your goal is, the movement you use has to be specific to that, right? And you have to evaluate the issue with your lift and think a bit critically about that, like I talked about in these examples, in order to find a movement that fits, in order to find a movement that tracks with the solution that you're looking for. You need to find a movement that provides a solution to the issue that you're experiencing in your lift, and then drives you towards your goal. And you can consider the effects on the exercise criteria in these assistance movements along the way. So to give one more example, here's an example of what not to do, right? So if you're a deadlifter and you have really short arms and your deadlift goes through a really long range of motion, then maybe you shouldn't program an even longer range of motion like a snatch grip deadlift or a deficit deadlift, right? Maybe you're kind of like exacerbating the issue there. Maybe your deadlift is already too stressful because of that long range of motion. So maybe rather than adding on more range of motion, you implement the rack pull and the halting deadlift like I suggested before. But maybe if you're a super long arm lifter, right, and you lock out like right above your knee in the deadlift, and you're finding that it's just kind of not stressful enough to drive progress, then maybe you're the type of person that should implement like a snatch grip or a deficit deadlift. Let's say you already have like a 550 deadlift because your leverages are so favorable, then maybe it's a good idea to implement a longer range of motion pull on like a volume day to get, a different kind of stimulus going on, different kind of stress. But yeah, that's it for the video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Leave some comments down below. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you want to see in future videos. And that's it. Have a great day, pal.